This is a new series. Dave has given me the responsibility of starting a new series. Remember, we've gone through the life of Joseph, and it actually does. I do mention Joseph in this talk, but when I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, it just didn't seem to work. There was something a bit odd about it, and it was like it was in two halves. So Dave said to me, "Well, why don't you teach it in two halves?" So this is what I'm going to do. Have you ever heard that the football commentators say it's a game of two halves? Football's a game of two halves, which sounds ridiculous, but actually it's quite relevant because it means that although it's the same game, there's the same teams playing, one half is completely different to the other, or seems to be, but they are the same, they're linked. So it sounds a bit mysterious, but I'll get there in the end. So you can see what this series is going to be on, because on the notice board there, on the projector, it says, "I am who I am," and I've written, "and I am." Yeah. Okay, so I am who I am, and I am is my talk. So we're going to be looking at the statements that Jesus made about himself, the I am statements. They're written in the Gospel of John, and if we look at those, let's see if I press it the right way. Yeah, oh, that hasn't come out terribly well. But there are the 7 statements up there on the board. And I'm going to be looking at the first of those statements that you can see on the top left, "I am the bread of life," next week. Which is why... No, I'll start again. Okay. Before I get to that, I want you to look at this screen. I don't know if you can see it. I'll read them out. It says, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I am the vine." There's one I've missed out there, which you might be able to see. If you imagine that you asked me what my name was, and I said, "I'm a person that trains carers. I am married with a daughter. I am interested in all sorts of things. I make my own wine." You know, all sorts of things I could say. If I didn't give you my name, that would seem a bit weird, wouldn't it? Yeah. Actually, God does give his name, and we're going to be looking at that really important I am statement from God before we look at the I am statements from Jesus, because the two are linked. So what's in the name? Well, our culture doesn't pay too much attention to our name, does it? Other cultures do. They place a lot of importance on your name, what it means. So what's my name? I'm Peter. Where's that come from? Well, it's derived from the word Petra, which means rock. I don't often feel very rock-like, but that's where my name comes from. My second name, which I don't use very often, is James. And that actually comes from my uncle. My uncle Jimmy. Have a guess where he was from? Scotland, yeah, Uncle Jimmy from Scotland. So that was where my second name comes from. My surname is Mizen, and it's not very clear but where that comes from. It's actually got 2 Z's in the mizzen mast, so that's not right. My name's only got 1 Z, so it doesn't come from some shipping background. But my older brother, he's traced back our family tree a few hundred years, actually, to Essex, which he was pleased about, because that's where he lives now. So it might have been people from Holland who came over and settled in Essex, because it's a Dutch name. So our names can be significant. They might not be in our culture. They certainly are in the Bible. If you think about Abram, God changed Abram's name to Abraham. Sarai, he changed to Sarah. Jacob, we've been hearing about before, he changed to Israel. And Jesus changed Simon's name to Peter. Yeah. Remember Isaiah's sons? Isaiah named his elder son Shear Jashub, which means a remnant shall return. There you are. So when you say, hello, Isaiah's son, you're saying, hello, a remnant shall return. And the second son, very sadly, he named Mea Shalai Hash Baz, which means quickly to spoils, plunders speedily. I'm so glad Isaiah wasn't my father. And you know, names can shape personalities.
Yeah, can.
They are. A bit of contemporary culture there. There's Homer Simpson. He changed his name to Max Power and became much more dynamic and much more successful. And in fact, I'll stop going on about names in a minute, but I was a teacher for 26 years, as I'm sure most of you know by now, and I came across some very interesting names. I do hope she's not listening, but
This is recorded, isn't it?
it is recorded. There's a girl called Indy. Nothing wrong with that. That's quite a common name for a girl. Her full name, Indigo River Mountain. That was her real name. And in my care job, since I've been working in the office for the last year and a bit, I get there's loads of emails that have come which have got nothing to do with me, and I don't open them, but they are from carers who want to apply to be a carer, or from people who want to apply to be carers. And a lot of them are from Africa. So I've made a note of some of these names because they just bowl me over. There's faith, charity, beauty, mercy, praise. So you've probably heard all these. Patience, angel, everjoy. What a lovely name. Marvellous, witness, purity, love more, highness, 10 duchess, more blessing, goodwill, and then the slightly older ones, fortunate, maybe, fungi, really, and mould. And when we went to South Africa quite a few years ago now, excuse me, there was a guy there, he was a lovely man, it's called Anyway. Fancy me called Anyway. So let me take you back to our series on Joseph. Remember that Joseph brought his family to Egypt because there was a famine, and he had that position of power, and he allowed or asked Pharaoh for his family to actually settle in Egypt, which they did. Some 400 years later, God's people were actually enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. We don't know what happened in that 400 years because the Bible doesn't tell us, but something went wrong there because God's people were now slaves. And then God rose up Moses, remember, and Moses killed an Egyptian in an argument. He realised he was in trouble, and he ran away to Midian, which was a long way away. And what he did, he became a shepherd. He tended the sheep of his father-in-law. And while he was doing that, at one point he saw the famous burning bush. Now, here's my holiday snaps. This is Mount Sinai, the top of, at dawn, and that's Jenny, our daughter. Well, I wondered if it's Joseph with the coat of many colours which have faded, but they lent us these blankets, which horrible, rather than being freezing. It's very high and very, very cold out there. But it was amazing to actually go up Mount Sinai. That was 2006, didn't time fly? There's a picture of it, sort of stereotypical picture of Mount Sinai. And just to prove that I was there, there's the camels.
Well, we thought you were showing us a picture of you.
No, should have done. So Moses saw that burning bush, and the bush was burning and it didn't go out. So he thought, this is a bit odd, as you would. And God called Moses out of the burning bush. And it says in Exodus 3:6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then God tells Moses that he's seen the plight of his people in Egypt, and he's going to get Moses to talk to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Not surprisingly, Moses thinks that God has either got the wrong plan or he's got the wrong person. So I'm going to pick this up from verse 11, which is on the board. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, Isaac and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now, I must admit, when I first read that, years and years ago now, when I first became a Christian, God calling himself I am seems a bit odd, doesn't it? It's a strange thing to call yourself. Picture of Popeye. Probably dates me a bit, but quite a few of you are getting on in years, so you probably recognise Popeye. He said, I am what I am, that's what I am. Yeah. Okay? And actually, many people today follow Popeye's philosophy, don't they? It is me that's the most important thing. Not necessarily to hell with everybody else, but it is me that is number one. And, you know, a bizarre thing happened. I actually really enjoyed what was a popular film with sort of popular music, which I didn't really expect. I absolutely love it. I've seen it about 3 times now. It's called The Showman, or The Greatest Showman. And it's a great film, but that song, that famous song, This Is Me, well, what's that all about? Well, it's about me. It's not about other people. And if you look around you in our culture, what do we see? We see adverts, we see books, we see films, we see all sorts of things, all about people finding themselves. And they're finding themselves through who they are, or they're finding out who they are. Which, if you think about that as a Christian, that is totally upside down, isn't it? People don't seem to be considering who God is. They don't seem to be considering other people. But as Christians, we should be looking at ourselves as God sees us. And it's only God that can justifyingly say, I am who I am. There's a guy called John Piper, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, and I've mentioned him before. He's an amazing writer, but he just writes so much. It's really hard to sort of put it all together. But this is what he says. I'm going to read what he says, and I have cut it down quite a bit because it goes on and on. But he says this: God gives Moses and us his name. It's almost always translated Lord in the English Bible, but the Hebrew would be pronounced something like Yahweh, and it's built on the word for I am. So every time we hear the word Yahweh, or the short form Yah, which you hear every time you sing Alleluia, it means praise Yahweh, or every time you see Lord in the English Bible, you should think this is a proper name like Peter or James or John, built on the word for I am, and reminding us each time that God absolutely is. This is amazing, says Piper, and I agree. God gave himself a name used over 4,000 times in the Old Testament that presses us, when we hear it, to think he is. He absolutely is. He is absolute. Yeah. We are blown away by the sheer fact that God is, that he is who he is, that he absolutely is. I think he's making his point well. And he gives 10 things that it means when God says he is. Number one, God never had a beginning. That staggers the mind, certainly does. God will never end. God is absolute reality. God is utterly independent. Everything that is not God depends totally on God. All the universe, by comparison to God, is nothing. God is constant. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He cannot be improved. He is not becoming anything. He is who he is. There is no development in God, no progress. Absolute perfection cannot be improved. God is the absolute standard of truth, goodness, and beauty. God does whatever he pleases and is always right, always beautiful, and always in accord with truth. God is the most important and the most valuable reality and the most important and most valuable person in the universe. He is more worthy of interest and attention and admiration and enjoyment than all other realities, including the entire universe. Wow. This is what we believe. God is. It is a wildly untamable, explosively uncontainable, electrically future-creating reality. God is. Wow. I think Mr. Piper's pretty impressed by God's name. Are we impressed by God's name? So I hope you see the relevance of God's name, not only in part 2 next week, but also throughout this series. So God has called himself I am, but who is Jesus? Fundamental question. Recently had a brief conversation with one of the carers that work in my company. I took her to a client's house because she doesn't drive. And I found out from her that she's a Christian. There's quite a few carers seem to be Christians. And I asked her about her church. Her church is a very orthodox church in Eastern Europe. And she described it a little bit. And I said, well, in our church, we try to be quite informal. Everyone's encouraged to contribute. They don't always contribute, but they're encouraged to contribute. And our worship is often joyful and exuberant. Well, she said, that's fine. We're all worshipping the same God. Okay, good. Then she said she started to go to Jehovah's Witness church in her country, and she's not going there anymore, but she thought it was pretty much the same as her church. And she said to me, they use the same Bible, you know. And I said, yeah, I think there might be one or two things which are a bit different. I said, they don't actually believe that Jesus is God, do they? And she says, well, of course he's not God. He's God's son. Jesus wasn't God, he was God's son. And I thought, oh my goodness, here we are. What am I going to do with this? I've got 2 minutes. So actually I didn't go into theory about the Trinity and the discussions over the centuries about the divinity of Jesus. But can you see it's really important for us as Christians to know who Jesus is? Okay. When I was teaching, there was a really lovely Muslim guy, one of the teachers. It was fantastic. He used to do these really annoyingly fantastic assemblies because he would have a sort of Islamic slant to it, and I thought, no, muck it up. No, I didn't, of course. Oops. But we had some good conversations about who Jesus is, and of course the Muslims think that Jesus was just another prophet.
Yeah.
In fact, if you said that Jesus is God to a Muslim, they'd be highly offended.
Yeah.
So it's really important as Christians that we really understand and get in our hearts who Jesus is. So hopefully this series of talks is going to be helpful. Those statements leave no doubt about who Jesus is. They give us an understanding of not only who Jesus is, but also of who God is. Because when we look at Jesus, we see his care, his kindness, his sinlessness, his love, his strength, his power. I could go on and on and on. What we're looking at is what God is. We're looking at what God is like because Jesus is God. And if you're still wondering about this, is Jesus God? Jesus makes a very important statement in John 8:58, I think it is. He makes this I am statement about himself, and it's the same wording as God uses for himself. And it's so obvious to the Jewish people that they start picking up stones, because in the Old Testament it says anyone who blasphemes the name of God will be stoned to death. So they start picking up stones because Jesus has said, I am God. And Dave's going to expand on that later on in the series. So think about that important I am statement that Jesus made about himself, not only as we go through this series, but also when you're talking to other people about who Jesus is. And look out for people who say, well, he was only God's son, not God. Because people need to know that I am is God, and Jesus said, I am. So next week, I'll be looking at Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. So hope that's blown your brain. Let's just pray.